keep saying it, David is human. We've seen him filled with faith, moving in God's will, certain that what God has purposed, he will bring to pass. And we've seen him given to fear, anger, and impulsive decisions. In the last chapter, David had a godly assurance. King Saul was coming after him, and he was proactive. He went into Saul's camp, took his spear and jug of water as he slept, and let Saul know that once again, David could have killed him, but he didn't. And when Abishai, one of David's men, wanted to kill Saul, this is what David said. As the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him, or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down into battle and perish. David knew that God had anointed him to be the next king of Israel, and God would take care of Saul. The Lord had even encouraged him in this through different people. In 1 Samuel 23:17, Jonathan found David in the wilderness and said, "Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel." In 1 Samuel 25:29, Abigail said to David, "Should anyone rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, then the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the hollow of a sling." In the last chapter, King Saul even said, "Blessed are you, my son David. You will both accomplish much and surely prevail." But right now, David is not convinced of any of that. Let's see where his head is. I'm in chapter 27, verse 1, reading from the New American Standard Version. Then David said to himself, "Now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines. Saul then will despair of searching for me anymore in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand." David's faith has spiraled downward. Notice he's saying this to himself. I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. We know what this feels like, that deep discouragement within, despite the promises of God. David has seen God's amazing protection, but somehow he now thinks that Saul will get the upper hand and kill him. And his solution is to seek protection from the enemies of God's people, the Philistines. He says, "There is nothing better for me." David is not focused on the Lord. He's lost sight of his goodness. He's not clinging. Verse 2, "So David arose and crossed over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maach, king of Gath." David has been here before. Remember in chapter 21, he fled to Achish, king of Gath, and it didn't go too well. He ended up feigning insanity to get out of there. Important to note as well that soon after that, the prophet Gad told David to go into the land of Judah. God has not changed his mind about where David needs to be. Going to Gath is David's decision, born of doubt and fear. Continuing verse 3, "And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each with his household, Even David with his two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. Now it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. So David's plan worked in this sense. Saul is no longer after him, but it doesn't mean David is in God's will. Verse 5, then David said to Achish, if now I have found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country, that I may live there. For why should your servant live in the royal city with you? David is smart. His request sounds as if he's merely being gracious. We're just humble servants. We don't need to be in the royal city with you, King Achish. In reality, he wants to be out from under King Achish's watchful eye and have their own sort of refuge in the midst of Philistine territory. Continuing verse 6, so Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Does that not strike you like, wow, 1 year and 4 months? First, it's striking to get a little understanding of how long David was on the run. And this is just one period of time. And the fact that he spent this much time in Philistine territory is remarkable. David got his fame from killing the Philistine giant Goliath. And David's got much favor here. But we're about to see how David gained so much favor with King Achish. Continuing verse 8, now David and his men went up and raided the Jeshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. These are all enemies of Israel. For they were the inhabitants of the land from ancient times, as you come to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. David attacked the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive. And he took away the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, and the clothing. Then he returned and came to Achish. Now Achish said, where have you made a raid today? And David said, against the Negev of Judah, and against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, and against the Negev of the Kenites. David is raiding territories that are enemies of Israel, but he's telling Achish that he's attacking his own people in Israel. Achish knows that King Saul and his men were after David, and David had to flee. So Achish thinks David is getting revenge on his own people. And of course, Achish loves this. Israel is one of the Philistines' longtime enemies. And now they've got Israel's fiercest warrior fighting on their side against Israel. But he doesn't know David is lying and scheming. Continuing verse 11, David did not leave a man or a woman alive to bring to Gath, saying, otherwise they will tell about us, saying, so has David done, and so has been his practice all the time he has lived in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, he has surely made himself odious among his people Israel. Therefore, he will become my servant forever. Achish thinks David is now hated among his people, and David is actually gaining more and more favor among his people because he's taking out Israel's enemies. And no more starving in the wilderness asking people like Nabal for food. David is bringing home all the spoils: sheep, cattle, camels, clothing. It's a masterful scheme outside of God's will. David will soon find himself over his head. Discouragement can be a powerful thing. It comes upon us, invades our thoughts, takes over our emotions. It insists that this particular situation is hopeless, and it moves our focus away from God. Like David, we might seek our own solution, something that will satisfy, at least in the short term. We seek a temporary refuge. But look what David said when he was focused on God after his encounter with Saul in the cave. Psalm 57, 1 and 2. Be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until destruction passes by. I will cry to God Most High, to God who accomplishes all things for me. When discouragement floods your soul, let your soul take refuge in God. This is the blessing we have as believers in Christ. Nestled right in the shadow of his wings. Do you know how much protection is in that place? How much power? He will comfort you there. He will remind you of his goodness, of his promises toward you. He will restore your peace and your joy. Cry out to God Most High. Believe that he accomplishes all things for you.